We have our judges, and with huge honor, I'd like to announce the team in opening government, Malaya A! Joining them in first half is the team from opening opposition, Continuing to second half, the Dutch flag is already hanging there, in closing government, Leiden C! And the last team in this ESL final is the team in closing opposition, Tel Aviv B. One more warm welcome for the ESL finalists, WUDC 2017! To announce the motion for this ESL final, your CA, Karin Merkens.
I would like to wish all 4 teams in the ESL final the best of luck, and on the motion that this House would force all news organizations to run as non-profits, I would like to get this debate started. Good luck!
Alright, welcome everyone to this ESL Grand Final. I'm now going to call on the Prime Minister of this debate to open the motion that stands in their name.
Testing. Panel, we think there's a problem in status quo when it comes to the method in which news organizations deliver news. When we talk about news organizations such as the New York Times, CNN, these are big news companies and organizations that are very profit incentive, meaning the news that they deliver and their main goal is to make as much profit as possible as to sustain their the organization livelihood. We think the problem that exists with this is that there's a conflict within the purpose that news organizations have to serve, which is to inform people, and also their other goal, which is to make profit. We think that this is problematic because it affects the types of news that is delivered towards people, and we think that we, on-site opening government, seek to solve this problem. What is a model that we will propose coming up from OG? We think that now all news organizations will henceforth stop being profit incentive. They will all be non-profit incentive organizations, and we think they'll be heavily funded by the states of these countries. And we are also okay with things like donations, things like recruitment drives of donations, things that you already see existing in activist groups, and also, like for example, the Red Cross and other NGOs in terms of getting funding. We think the stance and the burden coming out from the opening government is that we would posit to you that we will get better delivery of news, and we'll get news that is more credible and trusted by the public in order to garner public interest and public
clarification.
Please sit down. Okay. No. So we think that non-profit journalism is a concept that is not new. Non-profit journalism has existed for a long time. For example, during the 19th century, please sit down, there were 5 New York newspapers that posited non-profit journalism in covering the Mexican-American War, in talking about what were the incidences that happened during this war, the atrocities that happened, and covered it to their best extent. These 5 New York newspapers came on to become the Associated Press, which till date is something that is highly taken into consideration. So we don't think this is a new concept per se, but we think it's good that we extend it to apply to all. In my speech, I'll talk about 3 constructives. First, the principle of news and why do we think news should be made free. Second, the conflict of interest that exists between delivery of news and also their duty in making profit. And third, how do we get a better representation of news under our side? Please sit down. First, principle of news and why do you think it should be free? We think that in status quo, most of the elements or utilities that are either heavily subsidized or are made free are things that are essential to human beings within this context of livelihood. This would include things like water, food, shelter, and hygiene, things that are highly subsidized by many countries around the world. Throughout the decades, we have evolved and started subsidizing other utilities or essentials that we deem important. These are things like education, sit down, things like healthcare, which are important towards these individuals because we recognize at this point in time, we are to give them things like education because it's important to individuals. Why do we think news is one that falls within these criteria of importance? The impact of news, of you reading news and finding out about information around the world is twofold. First, it informs you about the whereabouts about either current issues within the context of your country or the country outside. But also second, it educates you, and these things are important because it affects on how you make decisions and how you go about in your life. To that extent, we think news is something that is important, and in the 21st century, it should not be one that is made, that people have to pay money to get. Meaning, we are not going to be okay with things like subscription fees that you have to pay when you go buy New York Times or even Economics to some extent, because we think these are news that are important and it should be clarification and readily available to all. This is the important, the principle in this. Before I go on closing.
Am I allowed as an individual, a rich one for example, to be the owner of such a non-profit news organization?
No, you can't be the owner of such news organizations because that would mean that you're owning it and then profit is comes into impact and then, yeah, no. Second argument, conflict of interest. Why do we think this is an important argument? Note, to understand this, we have to talk about what is the business model that a normal corporation or company goes by when it is profit driven. The business model is one that your primary
anything is to make profit, where your board of directors within your organization tell you that whatever you do, you must make sure we have enough profit to sustain the company's survivability, but also to provide dividends to whatever shareholders we have, and etc. We think the problem that arises from this is that people always focus on what is important to make profit. And why is this one that we cannot reconcile with the purpose or the utility that comes with news organizations? Because when it comes to your duty to inform or educate society, we think there's a conflict that arises when you have to sacrifice elements of good journalism in order to make your article one that is as sexy or over-sensationalize this in many examples. For instance, individuals going against journalism ethics, imposing gory images that affect people. For instance, the refugee crisis that affected EU and also the Rohingyas fleeing from Myanmar, where a lot of these articles that were published by news websites faked the images that were put on their sites. They were taken from different areas of tragedies, for instance, the Nepal earthquake, for them to just hype up and show people that this is how bad it is. The problem with that is that you fake news to some extent in terms of the evidence that you garner, and you just oversell and over-sensationalize it, because why? You need to get as much profit as possible, and you sacrifice things like getting perhaps consents of victims or respecting the needs of these individuals, and we think this is one that's problematic. Please sit down. I'm not taking any more. So we think the conclusion to the second argument is that a corporation that is business-minded and has a business model cannot be one that is also going to inform people to this best extent, because they will always fall secondary to their interests. Third argument, why do you think we get better representation of news under our side? We would posit to you that in status quo, like because of a lot of over-sensationalizing and over-hyping, there are a lot of news that goes under the radar because it's not as sexy or it doesn't plead to the masses. We think these news are also news that are important, meaning smaller news, be it conflicts that exist between smaller parts of countries, between conflicts that people think, oh, it's normal for a conflict to happen in Iran because the situation in Iran is as such. We think this is problematic when people focus on things like more like the Paris incident as opposed to the Turkey incident that was recently occurred. We think this is problematic under our side when people tend to cater to individuals on their buyers or their customers as opposed to fulfilling their prior need, which is just informing people about what happened and why we think that is one that is good. Panel, at the end of this debate, we think news is an important utility and we don't think money should be added into it to make it clouded because we think it defeats the purpose of news. We're proud to propose.
Thank the Prime Minister very much for that speech, and now I'd like to welcome the opposition leader to open the opposition case.
If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is, right? So what this side wants is you don't get to pay for anything that you're going to read, the news that you're going to get. I think that's something that is harmful, right? I just want to have one engagement and then I move on to my constructives. The rest of my rebuttals will be integrated within that, right? So they say they want news to be free. I think companies already have an incentive to do that to an extent, at the point in which you have an incentive to at least reduce the cost at which you give news to people. Note that they have to defend non-profits. There are many ways you can get profit, right? So if what they don't want is the direct influence of people within those news companies, there are things such as ads that many news companies use. Presumably, they still want these things because you still need this news media, these news channels to still be something that's sustainable in themselves, right? This means that you can make profit through those things. They need to tell us why, even within that context, that's something that is problematic. But secondly, they miss the context of how news is moving towards social media, and in many cases, there's already an incentive to provide as many articles to people for free. The reason why many people do this is an incentive for you to then become a member, right? And that's an incentive that they have actively. So they give you news as much as possible for you to consume for free, and then if you want more, you can then go and subscribe towards those things. I also think the subscription fees are things that aren't so burdensome because in many cases, they want you to read these things, and at the point in which it's so high, they know that they lose the incentive for many people to be interested in reading it. So they said, actually, let me move on to my case. Two arguments I will bring in. Firstly, why profit incentive isn't a bad thing, and secondly, what the nature of news would look like in the absence of profits. First argument, why profit incentive isn't a bad thing. I think non-profit isn't a virtue because the problem they analyze with profit is the fact that you want money, and that's something that skews your ability to provide news to people in a way that is good. The problem with this is Non-profits also suffer from the same incentives because you still need money to run your businesses. They still suffer from the same corruption. They still suffer from all those incentives. The distinction here is, at the point in which you have profits, in many cases you have somebody who is profiting or giving the resources to that business. That means you have a backbone and you have an assurance of resources. The distinction on this side is, at the point in which you're a non-profit, you don't know where the next cash is going to come from. And in many cases, you need to do things to ensure that that cash comes to you as that news media. What does that mean? That means there's an incentive for you to go through all the corruption that they talked about, right? I'll be expanding more on this within my second argument, but there's already an incentive for you to do as much as you can to ensure that you get the resources that you need to provide the next news. That's something I would think it's harmful. What's important to note is that the money that people have in status quo, that news media have in status quo, is money that they are sure of, right? That in the next day, they can still be sure that this person is going to give them this resource. The reason why that's the case is because people have an incentive to invest within news because they know they can make money out of that news. At the point in which you take out that incentive, there is no reason for me to pump in money except for corrupt purposes, right? Except I want to skew that news. Those are the only kinds of people that would pump in money on this side of the, or the vast majority of people that will pump in money on this side of the house, right? But secondly, what's the nature of news going to look like on that side? 3 things to note here. Firstly, I think investigative journalism is something that suffers on this side of the house. The ability for news media to take proactive stances in researching and going full out in finding out information. In many cases, this means that you have to go through to information that is hidden, information in many cases that costs you to travel, that costs you to go all out to find this information. At the point in which you don't have the amount of money that you can use to do these things, assuming best case on this side of the house, right? At the point in which you don't have the resources, it's extremely hard for you to do so. That means you need to calculate what sort of news you're going to provide to the public, right? At the point in which it costs you huge sums to do that investigative job that you want to do, and you're able to still get some jobs done without that huge sum, you're likely to drop that investigative work as a whole, right? It also affects your ability to get credible journalists and people who you're able to cut into your own franchise, right? That you tell them that we're able to give you the resources, and these are people who have access to information in different areas, right? Your ability to do that is something I would think is harmed at the point in which you don't have adequate resources on your hand, right? Why is this extremely bad? Secondly, it reduces the protection that you have as a news media channel. It's important to note that at the point in which you do things such as investigative journalism, or you just publish things that hurt the feelings of Donald Trump, you are going to be sued, right? And that's something that is extremely harmful. The ability for news media to know that if we get sued, there is money that I can use to protect myself is something that is missing on this side of the house, because you still need to convince those people that you want to give you those resources, right? And that's something that we think is harmful. That backbone of resources that you have is important for you to go all out, for you to do things that are daring within the news media, and that seems to be something that they want on this side of the house. We think you harm their ability to do so. And by the way, this is not just Donald Trump, right? Even literally Obama has literally sued judges and done things like this, right? We think it's harmful. Even corporations that don't like what you publish are still going to take these actions. Thirdly, it reduces the perception of credibility. What they recognized was that money scrutinizes news, and the most relevant news is what receives the funding. On this side of the house, actually before I go on closing, opening.
Okay, if all the harms that you're stating about non-profit news organizations is true, then how is it that organizations such as Huffington Post in status quo, which is non-profit, survive?
They suffer from those incentives. The distinction is you are not having 1 or 2 people who are non-profit. You are having everyone become non-profit. If Huffington Post is able to get some resources from a few donors, you expand the amount of people that need those donors at the point in which all news needs to get resources from these people. That's something you need to engage with. You reduce the perception of credibility on this side of the house because money scrutinizes news and gives resources to what is more credible. On that side, when that goes away, even the person who just prints any article at his back door is able to assess the same level of competition at the point in which you don't have those amounts of resources. That means things such as fake news, things such as news that is blatantly wrong are able to survive because they don't have any interest to ensure that they are legitimate, because the reason for legitimacy in many cases is for you to get resources. Fourthly, I think this reduces the level of independence that you have. Why is that the case? Because you're constantly beholden to a group. In many instances, that group is a majority within a country. In many instances, that group is a political party It's the rich people that they want to stop on this side of the house. If I'm able to give that news media that is dry and is so much in need of resources, money, and I know that I can have a condition in giving them that money, that's something that happens on this side of the house. I don't think non-profit is a good in itself because it still suffers from the same incentives of corruption.
Thank you very much, the opposition leader. Now I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the government case.
Testing. Debating 101. You're not supposed to just give me a laundry list of the benefits of what you can have on your side. You need to compare and trade off those analyses to things that my Prime Minister has clearly told you in the debate. Things, for example, like the fact that when you have a profit incentive, there are chances of you more likely than not sensationalizing news and going to cover things, for example, that may not be in the best interest of information may necessarily happen on your side. We on Team Beyonce 1A are going to do that for you. To that extent, I have 3 questions that I'm going to answer. Firstly, the alternative that they provided on social media, whether or not is that good. Secondly, on what profit incentive creates when it comes to the minds of these news organizations. And thirdly, why it is absolutely abhorrent to monetize information. Let's just move into the questions. Firstly, on what necessarily is it the alternative that they provided. They provided one alternative in the sense of social media. Wow. Like we think that a lot of times the fact that social media is free and always think and thought that it's at the tips of your fingers is the reason why a lot of times people opt into it in the first place. The idea that you don't have to pay a single cent and you can always have the wealth of information of everything that happens around the world within your reach is one that causes them to not pay, for example, your cheap subscription fee of $14 per year to still opt into social media. To the extent we say we have to compare, we would rather people, for example, be able to access this information for free because we realize the credibility of news organizations that is still, for example, subjected to legislation that the state is willing to stand by. Meaning to say, on your side, you have to defend the alternative where people or individuals on the ground find that news organizations, for example, are too expensive, or even, for example, because of the marginal cost that they have to incur, opt into, and all the harms of your side will materialize. Secondly, they say, oh, you still need money to sustain. Like, I think it was pretty clear in Venu's speech that we say that the state is going to subsidize you similarly to how, for example, it subsidizes utility. This means to the extent that we are going to say that the message that we are sending is clear, that news is not something that can be monetized. News is something that is a public utility. So on our side of the house, then we provide them the sustainability that opening opposition say they needed. But then this hilarious argument on, oh, guys, we need to give them money because they'll be sued. Well, you know why they are sued? Because they are bad in covering news. They, for example, often resort to things like sensationalizing news to the extent they get sued. So on our side of the house, when they have no incentive, for example, for them to sensationalize news, they will be more, for example, careful in selecting the news that they cover. They'll be putting more due diligence in making sure that they're not sued in our side. Under our side, we have number 1, more credible news, number 2, more neutral news, and number 3, more people can access it. All of these benefits which wouldn't exist and is mutually exclusive to our side, that opening opposition needed to tackle. Let's move into the second question then. On what necessarily happens when you monetize information. We think that we willingly concede on side opening government that some news organizations will cease to exist. And we think it's a good idea. Why? Because we think in the world that we have nowadays where everyone flocks to their preferred organization, it's very hard for the state to be able to realize and understand what necessarily is the best news. To the extent people, for example, rely on Britbird news like your alternative right, to the point that they are able, for example, to be susceptible to all those things. Realize that people who seek news are the most vulnerable. These are people who are left in the dark and, for example, rely on this information to be able to form their own identity, to be able for them to make rational decisions in their life. The minute you use this as a way of avenue for you to skew the perception for the worse, because you often have your profit incentive at the head of at the list of the priority, means that you often, for example, conflate the ability for you to provide information as a public utility to the point of you trying to, for example, skew information away from that. We say that the net harm of that is people who need information the most will often be the ones most susceptible to, for example, all the fake news and all the sensationalized news on your side. We think that right now the message that we're sending out is news organization is not a lucrative business. What does this mean? This means the only only people who really want to, for example, provide news will still remain. This means that people, for example, who always need to capitalize on the idea of selling news to the poor and using it as a means for them to milk them, won't be able to do that anymore. This means that they'll be, for example, disincentivized from entering into news organizations. And we say that if these people leave the arena of news organizations and less fake news are spread on your side, it's a marginal benefit on the side that you simply cannot provide. Because ultimately, listen to opening opposition. They never once, they also say that money politics is real when it comes to news organizations, meaning to say that their side has not provided us an alternative on what necessarily they're going to do to make sure that the situation gets better on them. I'm going to take closing.
Sorry. So Huffington Post is owned by Arianna Huffington, and according to the Prime Minister's model and answer to clarification, it will now be owned by the state. Will you please clarify what's going on, and what are the state's incentives in that case?
No, we think it's very clear to the point that we say that news should be treated as a utility by the state. Then we think that is something that we are willing to take away. But even if, for example, if these individuals that you say are rich and the reason why, for example, they are willing to remain in news organizations is, for example, to continue milking and monetizing information. The minute, for example, that we make sure that it's a non-profit organization means that they will most likely cease to, for example, do this development on this particular aspect and maybe move their businesses elsewhere. That's literally what my second argument is. You need to pay attention. Third question then, on what profit incentive creates. Notice that a lot of times opening opposition does not give you a clear idea or a fair characterization of what shit journalists go through. Two arguments under this. Firstly, a lot of times the idea of a news organization is that they will cut their costs. And how do they cut their costs? They underpay the journalists. They don't ensure that the journalists get proper insurance. They don't, for example, make sure that these individuals, they're overworked them to the point that they make them, for example, work in odd hours and are unable to pay them in the long run. This means that, for example, a lot of times journalists will be pressured into looking for money in the most limited way possible. And a lot of times, sacrifices the quality of their information because they ultimately only want to seek money, and they always want to make sure that the news organization is about to pay them the biggest slice of the cake. But secondly, talking about investigative journalism, a lot of times when news organizations are unwilling to pay them and journalists think that covering local news is something that that's not enough for them to sustain their life, these individuals are coerced and resorts to investigative journalism. The point that you tell them investigative journalism is the one that pays you the most means that journalists are more likely, for example, to go into places that they didn't want to begin with. This means that they are stuck in a dangerous situation. They're unable to be provided security because your news organizations always have an incentive to downscale their costs. This means that all the harms that we provided to you in opening government or news organizations can only be mitigated the minute we show individuals that news organizations are not a lucrative business, and we ensure that only people who want to provide the best of information to the society remains. On our side of the house, we realize that things like bias will still exist. Things like, for example, neutrality is very hard. But at least we reduce one avenue for them to do that. We're very proud to propose.
Thank you very much to the Deputy Prime Minister. Now, to conclude the opening half of this debate, I'd like to invite the Deputy Opposition Leader.
Panels, ladies and gentlemen, don't be fooled. Making news outlet not profitable does not lead to cheap, credible news outlet. We think here, we quite agree with side opening government in today's debate. When it comes to delivering news or how news should be delivered, it's an important utility. That's really important. But what we need to understand is, right, it also requires a lot of labor. It requires a lot of resources, and all these things are what you need money in order to be able to operate on. All they are doing on their side of the house is cutting down the values to which you can achieve this. We think here, monitorizing media outlet, it's something that is probably justified within those regards, right? So we think like two things are crucial to note in today's debate, right? Firstly, right, I'll be engaging on the fact that like, fine, like what are the incentives when news are like privately owned or when it's like profit driven or when private owners are profit driven? And secondly, right, exactly what's going to take over when you remove all these profit incentives from the side of the house, right? But before then, 2 points of rebuttals from the speaker before me, right? Because they said, right, one of the harms of having like profit incentives in media outlet means more often than not, this media outlet, right, will have to cut down costs so they can make as much profit as possible. We'll tell you that's not necessarily true because in the world we live in, it is a competitive world where if you don't pay your reporters well, if you don't pay your journalists, they will go to your competitors, right? So we tell you the market itself in nature, it's something that's self-regulatory in those regards. So we tell you, yes, they have incentive to be attractive. They need to be able to tell or go into contract agreement with the journalist, with the reporter on what they are able or what they should be doing in order to remain attractive. And then secondly, right, we tell you that in order for them to be able to be functional, they still hold some level of accountability to viewers that trust them, right? So you need to be able to provide and deliver quality services for the viewer, like for the viewer pool in which you are accountable to, right? So we tell you these are all incentives, right? But then secondly, right, would this actually lead to like media outlets actually being expensive? We tell you no, it's not true. The incentive to which each and every media outlet have are different. For example, you have the likes of media outlets such as the Stars in Malaysia. These are completely free newspaper outlets, right? They make their money through advertisement and stuff like that, right? You can continue to subsidize news within this regard, right? But we need to realize one crucial and important thing here, right? So even though these are subsidized media outlets, right, on a comparative level, the quality of news they deliver are different. You don't expect the kind of news you get from Al Jazeera, CNN to be as the same quality of the subsidized newspaper outlet. All these things requires money. You need money to pay your reporter to be able to go into the hearts of Somalia to find the news. You need money to be able to pay probably Mehdi Hassan to crucify a politician on televisions, right? Because we'll tell you that all these things are risk, right? If you don't ensure or guarantee financial security, even to your reporters or media outlet, the people you might want to like you hold accountable for issues such as state government will sue you, like my first speaker already told you, right? But let's look at how the cruciality of these incentives, right? Because we'll tell you, right, as a funder or as a like investor when it comes to media outlets, right, you're still worried about your pocket. Yes, you are profit driven, right? So how are you able to make this profit, right? In order for you to be able to remain on your A game, right? So in order for you to do this, right, you need to be able to offer a quality service within those regards, right? Because that's the only way you remain relevant, and that's the only way you are able or capable to make money to be able, because that's what return of investment means within those circumstances, right? But what the comparative is on their side of the house is, right, magically, they are only just gonna get NGOs to come in, swoop it, and make it a charitable organization. We'll tell you that's not true. The kind of people that will most likely opt into this are probably state-controlled media, political parties of control media, because these are the people that have the leverage of not having any form of monetary incentive. Do you want an oppressive government to be the one controlling how you discharge information within those circumstances without any form of counter-narrative to people? Because on your side of the house, even if at the very best you have NGOs coming in, they cannot compete with the wealth of these government institutions. Before I move on into the second clash opening,
I think you're conflating money to operate from profit, which is added revenue. Money to operate will still exist under our side because that's what we're giving. Why do you need extra revenue?
We'll tell you that this money you're getting on your side of the house, it's something that's like not enough within those circumstances. That's why I gave you the example of probably the Star newspapers and stuff and how they are unable to go through in discharging like credible or news that actually matters to people, right? Because these are things that cost money and humongous amount of money before they are able to achieve, right? So you need to tell us how you are able to garner attention, to garner this huge amount of like resources in order for you to be able to operate within the circumstance that they want to talk about, right? But then lastly, right, are these incentives necessarily bad? We don't think so, right? Because we think, like, first of all, we need to understand on a comparative, like, when it comes to incentive, they actually don't, like, get rid of those. Even their NGOs have incentives, right? They want to, the kind of news they want people to be able to access about them. Your government institutions have incentives. They have a policies or propaganda they want to propagate to people. We tell you, oh, if this is a harm on our side of the house, this is something they don't entirely get rid of on the side of the house, because they just can't comfortably assume that by cutting profit instead, everything or every investors coming in is just going to be selfless and just want what's best for the people, right? We think it's important to note in today's debate, right? Like, even with all those form of incentives, we think the incentive of, like, profit-reading media outlet, it's their pocket, and in order for them to be able to get those returns on their side of the house, they need to provide quality news. And then in terms of being expensive, we'll tell you no. Competition is something that already takes this away. And more importantly, right, you have other sources in which you can get all this free news. What's crucial to note is, like, in order for us to have mainstream media to the counter narrative of all the fake news that they want to talk about, they need to be able to be viewed as credible source of information. And all these things are what inquire, like, extreme, like, humongous amount of resources before they can achieve them. All they do on their side of the house is kill the credibility of news. Gladly oppose.
All right, thank you to the Deputy Opposition Leader. And now, to open the closing half of this debate, I'd like to invite the government member.
Leiden hoog. I'm going to put it up slightly higher. We good? We live in a world in which Rupert Murdoch owns an excessive amount of newspapers. We live in a world where journalists are being held in a chokehold by corporations when they want to do investigative journalism. We live in a world in which the potential for a far more diverse news market exists, but currently is being locked away by corporations and their ability to buy other organizations. 2 points in the speech. First, the influence of corporatism, distinctly new from just sensationalization, and therefore, what are the harms of that? Second, why do we create a far more diverse news market which provides to all? Rebuttal is integrated. First, the influence of corporatism. Opening opposition's main claim is you still want to get their money and therefore you want to sensationalize. But crucially, instead of catering to a corporation, they are on a large scale now going to cater to consumers or other individuals, given that they want to give money to you. What is the particular problem with uniquely catering to corporations when you want to increase your profit? First, investigative journalism gets far, far worse, because when you want to investigate, for example, a particular scandal in a company or a particular company doing something wrong, other companies are less likely to then give money to you. Why? Because you were a particular newspaper which hurt the interest of other companies, and they might potentially do that to you as well. That is not behavior which you want to encourage. You want to make sure that you can keep your own slate clean. So therefore, certain things don't come out, less accountability on their side of the house. Second, you get more colored news, right? Because if you want to attract, for example, these particular investors, you want to be seen as pro-business as possible. You want to color your news in a way which favors businesses, despite the fact that that might have harmful influences for society, and don't critically report on the particular types of policies and types of things which affect those corporations. Therefore, you have more colored news, less accountability on the their side of the house. So they said, oh, you get perverse incentives of the state. But look, guys, this is about charities, right? Non-governmental organizations to a large extent who will start themselves up, and crucially, this model allows for them to start up. They said investigative journalism doesn't exist and newspapers will get another. I'm now going to give a big point of rebuttal explaining why we'll get money and why these things will exist. We think we will get donations on an exceptionally large scale from other individuals. 3 key reasons. First, already individuals are willing to subscribe to a particular newspaper or another organization. That shows that they, to a certain extent, deeply care about that news and get joy from reading that news. If you know that right now, if I don't subscribe to, or like voluntarily subscribe or donate on a monthly basis to a newspaper, the news will go under, that is something you care about, and that is something you're willing to put money in, save up some money for. Second, Lots of individuals will understand the urgency, right? They understand that if they do not do this, to a certain extent, these organizations will go under. And given that they understand the particular importance, they want to uphold that. Finally, I want to just note that lots of people get enormous amounts of enjoyment from this particular news, and they read it on a day-to-day basis. Those people are just not going to stop giving money when all of a sudden the name changes from corporation to non-profit. The last thing I want to say here is that there's a particular context which is problematic for the case.
On that,
we have been moving into an era for online and social media. What does that do? The costs of running a news organization are much less. Why? Because you do no longer need printing costs, for example. You do not have, for example, need excessive amounts of time to set up those particular things because you can just post it on a blog or just post it on a website, which almost is very accessible. So the excessive amounts of costs, for example, for traditional newspapers existed, no longer exist right now. What does opening opposition say? There's an insecurity of money. You do not know whether you have money or not, therefore perverse incentives exist. Just like with charities, you know that certain people and a large group of people is willing to donate on a monthly basis. Therefore, you can project and know that you have money in the future. That is something you can predict. No thanks. Okay. Therefore, we decrease the influence of corporatism. Let's talk about a more diverse news market. What is the status quo? Lots of these particular news organizations are bought up by the same investors because they want to increase their market share. That is for two key reasons. First, when they have a larger market share, they can influence the market in a particular way which increases their profit and cater to their interests. Second, when they increase their market, they increase their market share by buying up particular news organizations which make a profit to maybe a higher extent. So that is why Rupert Murdoch owns multiple news organizations in the UK. What is the problem? Then single individuals or single corporations are able to use their influence, their personal biases, their political interests, or the interests of their corporation to influence the outside world. Why is this a particularly perverse influence? Because it's very hard to combat. If you are a politician or a business and you upset Rupert Murdoch or any of these investors, you can do very little. Why? Because the ramification is enormous, given that the entire news market will backlash against you. That is different when you have lots of small newspapers. Why? Because if you upset one small newspaper, the ramifications are to a far lesser extent exist. So therefore, we get less of that influence. How do we change that? You have less of an incentive to increase that particular market share of buy up other newspapers where you're not running a profit. When buying another one doesn't increase your market share and your ability to influence the market. Under the status quo, small new organizations are popping up, but they need to sell out. They need to sell out to large investors. Why? Because their particular shareholders who invested in the first place want to increase their profit and therefore give in to people like Rupert Murdoch. Small organizations which are currently flourishing because of online media are being locked down by the corporations and the profit incentives that they support. What is our side? Our side gets lots of smaller news organizations with completely different incentives. So here they said, oh, you still depend on the money, guys. Here's why it's different. You're not just dependent on a couple of big corporations, you're dependent on lots of different consumers and lots of different individuals. That is why there's then a much wider variety of interests across different actors, and therefore much more interest which you are going to be catering to, and therefore spread out to a larger extent the type of news you bring and the type of corporations that exist. Before I move on, please, opening, go ahead.
Right, so you need to understand that the burdens are asymmetrical. You need to explain why it's bad in all cases, not just a few. You said people are going to be spread across. That means there's no assurance. But if NGOs are subscribed the way you say, I don't know why they're going to be these angels when they know that news media highly depend on them.
So look. It is to a certain extent that you're dependent on donors, and maybe therefore to a certain extent, even though OG said sensationalization is to a certain extent the same on the Ourselves House. That's a very good point of rebuttal to them. It's not a good point of rebuttal to the corporate interest and the personal influence of investors. That is our extension. So what do we also get on the Ourselves House? We get more niche news. Why? Because if you're a large corporation and you want to cater to a particular majority, you don't talk about niche issues which affect small groups. Now you have an incentive to do so because you can gather the donations from that small group who deeply cares about that issue and is willing to donate to that newspaper on the basis that you're going to do that. Your incentive as a corporation is to neglect them because you only care about the majority and increasing the revenue. What are the outcomes of this? We get more diversity in papers and within newspapers. First of all, you have a greater choice. You can therefore pick newspapers which particularly inform you on the things you want. That increases the joy of customers. Second, you're better informed because you get more, like when different news organizations exist, more viewpoints are likely to be discussed rather than the narrow ones which exist on the status quo. Therefore, you're better informed and better able to make choices. But lastly, and I really want to emphasize this, there's less influence of corporatism. Currently, you're being lied to in the news on a day-to-day basis. That certain policies are particularly good for our world, but really, in fact, are not. That certain things are actually happening with corporations, which we do not know about. We want to quit that lie, and that's why you vote closing government.
Ignore me, I've completely forgotten I need to call people up to the stage. I'd like to thank the government member for that speech and invite the opposition member to continue this debate.
Tall man. Okay. So to quote something Thomas Jefferson probably never said, I know that Flores is here and he would rather not have this debate, but I would like to remind you that you are not the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister defined a model under which the government, at the point which the motion is enforced, at the point in which many newspapers are threatened with a shutdown, the government bails them out by buying them out. Flores did not mention that in a single word in his speech because he knows that that loses him the debate. That once we accept the amount of government ownership of newspapers that OG's model gave us, there are going to be calamitous consequences. We will also talk about the debate that Flores does want to be having and win that as well. Okay, so firstly on corporate influence. As we say the corporate, we'll give you a few points. Firstly, what do you get when you nationalize newspapers and what are the impacts? Secondly, what sort of rich people does that incentivize to move into owning newspapers via these NGOs? And thirdly, why profit incentives are not mutually exclusive with public incentives. So, before that, a little bit of rebuttal. Can I get time from somebody? Before that, a little bit of rebuttal. So firstly, Flores tells us that you have corporate influences and people are, and that would be very, very bad. We would like to remind that those corporate influences are often competing. And since this is a division of a finite cake of budget, you do have a balancing out. Secondly, we get this idea that Rupert Murdoch can never own a not-for-profit organization. Well, I'm lucky, or rather not lucky in this case, to come from a country where a man named Sheldon Adelson operates at a loss a huge newspaper. The fact that you have restricted the ability of people to make profit from that newspaper does not mean that they cannot operate it at a loss. Does not mean that they can have a so-called NGO, which they would be the primary funders of, who would be the holder of that newspaper. And they can't even ever make that away because there is no way to tell Rupert Murdoch apart from Arianna Huffington. And for some reason, they want one of them, but not the other. Secondly, so we get this idea that donations will be sufficient, and I do promise that we will deal with that directly in our points. So, firstly, what happens when you nationalize newspapers, and why are you going to see a lot of this Pravda-like nationalization? So we get from closing government this challenge that says they can live only on donations. But please notice, which papers have a subscription model? Only the most prestigious established papers, because most people are already used to only paying a finite cost for a newspaper and would not get used to paying more. Because a subscription model is something that really only the people above a certain socioeconomic level can afford, because they know how much money they'll make and they'll have. And those subscriptions tend to not be that cheap. This is the reason why in status quo we only see newspapers like The Economist, The Washington Post, or The New York Times, or everything all y'all debaters are subscribed to as the ones operating under subscriptions. Crucially, you can't operate under a donation when you're a smaller newspaper because the instability of receiving donations means that you are very, very fickle, that you could crumble at any point, that you don't have a steady stream of income. And since you would be competing with the already established newspapers, you're even more likely to not be able to exist. This means that more and more newspapers will be depending on government funding. Also, we get a challenge from closing government that says people will recognize the crisis. Please notice there is no need to recognize a crisis when the Prime Minister defines that he will bail out many newspapers should the readership not enlist to fund them. So we say similarly, the incentive structure is skewed there. So what happens then? We say that first Firstly, in many countries which this debate applies to, because this doesn't only happen in nice countries like the Netherlands, it is a very bad idea for the government to have a say over newspapers, and it will manifest in actual active involvement in the content that newspaper publishes. That not only applies to countries which aren't democracies or which are very fickle democracies in the developing world, but also just in general to democracies who aren't very liberal, like mine. Do you really want to see to see the Israeli government being the primary benefactor deciding which Arab newspapers get funded or don't get funded, and which content do you think they are likely to print when they are beneficiary? How does that mechanize? Well, in some countries it would mechanize by the rulers or the bureaucrats saying directly to the newspaper, listen, if you publish this about this minister, we're shutting you off, okay? We're shutting you down. You're not getting any more funding. And we say in many countries that this motion applies to in the developing world, but not only, that would be the case. I'll take you later, Florence. That would be the case. Secondly, we say that even in subtler ways it can manifest, because even in more liberal democracies, you still have lobbyists which would be able to gain access to replacing the sort of bureaucrats which decide over this, to replacing the sort of bureaucrats which make the list of which newspapers get which government funding. This is particularly pernicious because the minister doesn't care too much about that, because there's very little public accountability about these sort of affairs, but that enables a lot of influence. Yes.
So if Erdogan really wants to limit newspapers, can't he already censor them, ban them, at the point where they do harm his interests?
But isn't it so much more pernicious from a global perspective as well to have them actually actively print a made-up variety, like an illusion of a variety of information coming supposedly from different sides of the map, but actually being all under the same premises which keep the regime in control. This impact means that you'll have less newspapers because less newspapers can live off that. All of those will be centered under what the government wants, and minorities are highly unlikely to get a vote, especially national minorities which want independence. So, briefly on which sort of people with money would be incentivized to invest in those sort of papers. Because we say when you have a profit incentive, then the readers vote with their money to say what they want. When you have an ideological incentive to fund, that necessarily means a funding that's less directed towards truth and more directed towards getting an ideological outcome, since that's a much stronger incentive for an individual. That means that crucially, you'll have newspapers that are less concerned with truth. Compare that with populism. Well, at least on populism, you get it from both sides. For those reasons, we beg you to oppose.
All right, thank you very much to the opposition member. Now I'd like to invite the government whip to conclude the government side of this debate.
Leiden hoog!
We think that good news is news that holds people accountable. We think that good news is news that gives people information about all kinds of different things, which allows them to make a decision on what to vote for. We think shutting out specific voices because you are too rich, you are rich enough to buy other corporations, making sure that only your worldview actually influences the people that make a decision is wrong. We are very happy to oppose that and therefore proposing this motion. 3 things in summary. Firstly, what kinds of organizations will still exist? Secondly, independence and what happens to that? And thirdly, what happens to the landscape? So firstly, let's look at will they exist? Opening government tells you that donations are going to exist and that under their side of the house. It's unclear, however, why that's going to be enough to keep these organizations running. What do OO do? They have a very weird conception by saying, if you have no profit, then you have no money to spend on resources. There's a difference between having money for profit and having money to spend on resources. So you're still allowed, obviously, to pay your journalists, because that's not profit, that is just simply resources, right? So all of their problems just come from a very weird perception. Also, flight tickets to places, we think we can still pay for that, right? So what does Floris do? Floris embraces the context of social media. He explains to that the urgency of needing a lot of money completely declines under both sides of the house. So for example, before you had to buy broadcast time, you had to make sure that you print the papers, you needed to have like really good cameras. Right now, if you have an iPhone, if you have an iPhone and you have internet access, you can post everything. That means that everything is so much cheaper under both sides of the house, right? So we think that therefore that means that there's a lot less money that is necessary. So that context is very important. But Floris then adds other things. He explains to you other kinds of places where you can get money. Firstly, he says subscriptions. A lot of people currently already have a subscription, and that's already really important. So we think that is something that happens under both sides of the house. Plus, a lot of people think it's urgent, and a lot of people think it's joyful. So let's look at what the closing opposition says to that. So they say, firstly, they respond to that by saying only the prestigious papers are going to exist. We think that prestigious papers are going to be more likely to be outcompeted under our side of the house, because you are less likely to have like the big apparatus of a lot of different companies. So you're more likely, the threshold to start is much less big. So we think that is much better under our side. No, thank you. Opening opposition then also says the pool is smaller because now it's just a Huffington Post, but now you need more donations. Listen, it's a different pool of donations that we're going to get it from, right? From different kinds of readers, from different kind of philanthropists who think different kinds of things are important. We think that money is better, and we think that we can still do all of those things. So then let's look at independence, and then let's first take out what CO says. CO says government ownership is what happens. So firstly, Floris was not wrong. As a government, you can bail someone out, but that doesn't mean that after that, you own it, right? We think that bailing someone out is one moment thing. That means that can still happen independently afterwards. We heard no reason to why that's not the case under their side of the house. But secondly, even if it's not true, we think the state is more accountable than companies because states are dependent on people voting for them. We would prefer the state to be the one who funds them, even though we don't even have to defend that, right? So then they say, yeah, but then only things are going to be cared for if the government cares for it. Only then it's going to be funded. Firstly, a lot of governments don't have the bureaucracy to check every single thing that every news organization says. So we think that it's very unlikely that they're going to set up a new ministry who's then going to check everything that everyone said and then sue them if they're wrong, right? We think that's very unlikely. But secondly, we think that the people are going to be pretty angry if they hear that the government does that. We think that in many countries, that is not going to be something that the government has an incentive to do. But thirdly, if you have a government that really cares about news media and has the resources to check it, that will happen under both sides of the house. That is called censorship. That is not something that is going to happen under our side of the house. That is something that is very incomparable. So let's look at the other things of independence. Opening government tells you sensationalism is a thing, and that's because you're dependent on subscription on people reading you. So after first half, it is not necessarily one. It is unclear why donations would make papers less independent. Flores explains to you that the status quo is so much worse than everything that the opening half had dealt with. He explains to you about corporate interests, about people being much less likely to investigate certain companies who are very wealthy and very powerful, that the news that they give is very colored. So then CEO says, yeah, but they're competing, so it balances out, right? Not everything that competes balances each other out, especially not if the ones competing have very similar interests, because they are all rich, because they all don't care about the environment, because they're all wealthy companies that apparently can spend a lot of money on that. We think that is extremely important. That means that under their side of the house, you have these interests doing that. That is a very important point in this debate, because that proves that the status quo is so worse, is so bad, that being dependent on donations is so much less bad. And it's a comparative, right? So we think we win. So why do we think that we are better? Because you have smaller donations, because you're not allowed to have very big donations, and we think that the people who are going to give money are going to give less money because they are not going to get a lot of that back. Yeah, second half.
So if the New York Times loses money to those who owns it when it loses, but doesn't get them money when it gains, what motivation does it have to exist?
Okay, so We want papers who want to spread information. If they have good information and a lot of people like that, then we like them to exist, and then we think that it's important for them to have that. We don't understand why specifically the New York Times has to remain existent. If a lot of people don't want to read them, then we think that that's better, right? So we also think that because this is much shattered, we think that we win that. So let's look at what happens to the landscape. Flores explains to you what happens when you sell up a lot of different newspapers. That means that a lot of very diverse, different kinds of opinions are not read. That means a few things. First of all, a lot of people are extremely unhappy because they don't have access to news that matters to them. For example, sexual minorities or ethnic minorities in certain nations. We think that on itself is important. But secondly, because it completely lacks the information that everyone has, right? We think that some things are extremely important. First Hef explains to you why it's necessary for some kind of different information to be spread out. We give you the mechanism to why that's going to happen. Because these news organizations are much more likely to exist under our side of the house. They're going to be less dependent because they're going to be dependent on a variety, a big shattered organizations of different kinds of people who give some small amount of money. We think that at the end, you're going to need money, so you're probably going to depend on on things, right? Under their side, it's big companies, and you're going to have to push people out in order to exist. Under our side, it's shattered by different kinds of people who give different kinds of interests, different kinds of information. We think for all of those reasons, our world is so much more preferable. Please vote CG.
All right, thank you to the government whip. And now to conclude this ESL grand final, I'd like to invite the opposition whip.
This is really not a lot of space. Sorry. Okay. What is the burden on government side in this debate? Note that the motion clearly says that this House would require all news corporations to be non-profit. Why is this crucial? When OG come up and tell you, well, we believe people have a right for news, and we need unbiased rights, and we believe the state could fund that, even if it's true, great, have one. Take one news organization, subsidize it, you'll get all of the access that OG claimed that for some reason, even though I have reasons that they do exist in the status quo, that you'll have that news organization that you'll spread for free, and you'll have all other media organizations competing with each other, able to just investigate the government itself and everything else we tell you in this debate. Most of the analysis from OG is just clearly not meeting their burden. Two questions in this debate. Firstly, who are likely to own these newspapers? Secondly, because of that, but also independently of that, what sort of newspaper, what sort of journalism are you likely to see? All of the rebuttal is going to be integrated. Let's move on to the first question. So we got this very weird mechanism from OG, right? The government would stream money to those organizations. We'll analyze why it's practically owning them in a second. Or NGOs would own them because they have so much money to spend on newspapers and things like that. A couple of things there that we already tell you. Firstly, we just don't think that NGOs a lot of times have the money to spend on newspapers. And even if they do, there are very few that can own the vast majority of newspapers. There are a plethora of newspapers that exist under status quo. We just don't know why both governments think there are enough NGOs with enough stream of revenues to own them. Secondly, we tell you, that doesn't solve the problem, right? Rupert Murdoch can have an NGO that would still invest in there, something CG never address and never answer us to at any point. I'll take you later in my speech. But thirdly, and more crucially, what my partner tells you, even if you are capable of getting some funds from an NGO, it is so unstable, so fickle that you are still likely to go for government funding, right? Because if you depend on people's good willingness of thousands or tens of thousands of people, as CG would like to put it, to donate every month thousands of dollars in order to your newspaper to operate, this makes it very unlikely for you to rely solely on that, and therefore you are still likely to go for the government. What does this mean? The likely scenario that you're going to have is the government at least streaming most of the revenue or most of the money to operate, as OG would like to call it, for these newspapers, or solely the only actor capable of doing that, the only actor providing funds for these newspapers. Why is this such a bad thing? Moving on to the second question. CG would like to tell you corporatism is the issue. A, we're going to compare it specifically to state funding in a second, but moreover note the fact that A, they don't actually answer our answer about the companies competing with each other. What do they tell us? But they all want to pollute the environment. A, this is simply false. There is revenue, for example, from making the environment clean again. Secondly, there are rich people with a green agenda that exists under status quo who can own a newspaper, something they never engage with. Thirdly, as we've already said to you, they are likely to still be the owners to an extent of the newspaper through these NGOs. If they are the primary donor of that NGO and they can manipulate it, which is quite easy because sadly NGOs don't operate perfectly, and they are still likely to create this sort of corporatism. Even if there's a problem with corporatism and competition doesn't cancel it out, it doesn't get any better under their side, it only gets worse. But moreover, know that the analysis we give you about why donations are unlikely to be enough. Why is this crucial? I'll already tell you, this is very bad when governments or oppressive governments own newspapers. Here's CG's answer. Wait, if they are so oppressive, they can already do it under status quo. Note a few funny things. A, that contradicts their second answer to our case when they say, but they don't have the bureaucracy to fact-check everything else. That means that they also probably don't have the bureaucracy in order to make sure that their censorship practically works. But secondly, countries are just like ultra-oppressive or completely free in press. There is a wide range in the middle of it, where when you give state control over these newspapers, you are likely to see their effects. How? Because this is where my partner exactly analyzes and we're all miss, right? Because what we tell you is specifically how these things work. CG would like to tell you in response to our case that, you don't depend on them once you bail you out. But here's how it works. You still need a constant revenue of money. Considering how fickle other revenues are, you're still likely to be dependent to an extent on the government, even at the end of the day. Why is this crucial? Because at that point, everything we tell you about how government is going to influence inside of the sort of journalism you're going to see is true. They're going to tell you, drop that one article in order to get more stream in order to operate. Drop that one specific one that just like, you don't know what's there yet, which is a crucial thing, right? You only started investigating, but drop it off and we're going to still keep you alive and we're going to provide to you money. These are the most crucial parts of investigations. These are the ones where you're faced with the largest body and probably the most funded body in an entire country, the state, the one who harms people the most, right? Oppressing minorities is something that happens and could now be silenced. Huge-scale corruptions, not one company, but huge-scale corruptions of the government are now likely to be silenced specifically through that mechanism, specifically through saying to them, if you drop that one thing off where you don't even know because it's only the beginning of the investigation what it is, we are going to keep money streaming. Before comparing that to other things in this debate, why it's more important, OG.
Yeah, when the news industry is demonetized, rich business persons no longer have the incentive to remain in there. Tell me why again, why is corporate influence more benevolent than nationalization?
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Why is corporate influence more benevolent than nationalization?
A, because there is competition for companies which doesn't exist for the state, which is a sole actor. B, the level of atrocities the state is capable of doing versus a corporation, right? Even the largest corporations in most countries who have tens of thousands of employees, who affect the lives of hundreds of thousands, they are still not affecting everyone like the state. Let's move on to comparing this damages to other things here in the debate. CG would like to tell you there are going to be niches now, right? You're going to appeal to a niche. A, note that when they don't answer why the state is likely to be the actor in charge of these papers, that means that they lose simply by that. The state has no incentive to appeal to these issues. They have no incentive to keep the people who are more oppressed informed, meaning that if you want more news that are going to keep the oppressed people informed, it is better under our side, where there is some profit incentive to do it, when the state has an actual counter-incentive under the status quo to do that. Secondly, even if you accept OG's case about sensationalism, note a few things. A, comparatively, even if some people are less informed because they choose to read the sensational news, under our side of the house, you lose a huge stream of media, of information that you could have not gained otherwise. This is a terrible idea. Please oppose the motion.
All right, I think we owe all teams in this debate another huge round of applause and congratulations not only for making it this far, but for this debate.